Last month at Interior.
This week at Interior. Secretary Haaland visited 3 sites across New Mexico this week to highlight how federal investments are helping improve infrastructure on public lands, invest in local economies, and ensure that public lands are ready to meet the challenges of climate change. During her visits to Bosque del Apache National Wildlife Refuge, Socorro Nature Area, and Sevilleta National Wildlife Refuge, the Secretary underscored how the Great American Outdoors Act and other federal investments are putting billions of dollars toward infrastructure projects to ensure that visitors can continue to enjoy public lands for generations to come. Continuing the department's month-long tour to highlight the Great American Outdoors Act, Assistant Secretary for Fish and Wildlife and Parks Shannon Estenos traveled to Great Smoky Mountains National Park in Tennessee this week. Combined with investments from President Biden's Investing in America agenda, these historic investments are helping address overdue maintenance and repairs and meeting critical ecosystem resilience, restoration, and environmental planning needs. Deputy Secretary Tommy Beaudreau and Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs Brian Newland joined members of the Hualapai tribe this week for a celebration of the tribe's historic $312 million water rights settlement. The agreement provides much-needed water to the tribe and establishes a trust fund to develop water infrastructure on the reservation, providing certainty regarding access to water resources, enabling tribal economic growth, and promoting tribal sovereignty and self-sufficiency. Assistant Secretary Estenos joined White House Counsel Environmental Quality Chair Brenda Mallory and federal, state, and local leaders in Mississippi this week at a commemoration event at Grable Landing. That's the site where Emmett Till's brutalized body was recovered from the Tallahatchie River, one of 3 sites that make up the Emmett Till and Mamie Till Mobley National Monument. Emmett Till's racially motivated 1955 murder, the acquittal of his murderers, and the subsequent courage of his mother, Mamie Till Mobley, were a catalyst for the modern civil rights movement. The Bureau of Ocean Energy Management this week held the first ever offshore wind energy auction for the Gulf of Mexico region. The Lake Charles lease area received a high bid of $5.6 million. It has the potential to generate approximately 1.25 gigawatts of offshore wind energy capacity and power nearly 435,400 homes. The auction advances the president's commitment to deploy 30 gigawatts of offshore wind energy by 2030. The Bureau of Reclamation joined local and state partners this week to break ground on the next phase of a water project to bring a safe, reliable water supply to eastern New Mexico, thanks to more than $200 million in funding from President Biden's bipartisan infrastructure law. Once complete, the eastern New Mexico rural water system will convey water from Ute Reservoir to approximately 70,000 people. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Director Martha Williams was on hand this week as the service announced nearly $15 million in funding for 36 conservation projects in the Delaware River watershed. That support includes more than $4.5 million from the bipartisan infrastructure law for projects that will improve public access, recreational opportunities, and water quality, as well as enhance shoreline and wildlife habitat. The U.S. Geological Survey this week announced nearly $3 million in investments as part of the Urban Waters Federal Partnership. That funding includes $1.5 million from USGS, which will be matched by partners. It aims to reconnect urban communities with their waterways, particularly those communities that have been disproportionately impacted by pollution or economic distress. And our social media picture of the week, the Piedras Blancas light station on the California coast. Named after the white rocks that loom just offshore, the historic lighthouse offers breathtaking views of the Pacific Ocean, coastal wildflowers, and unique wildlife. Make sure you follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. That's This Week at Interior.
Last month at Interior.
This week at Interior. The nation paused this week to honor and remember the victims and heroes of the September 11th attacks 22 years ago. Secretary Haaland joined service members at the National 9/11 Pentagon Memorial, which commemorates the 184 lives lost when American Airlines Flight 77 was flown into the Pentagon. The National Park Service awarded $4 million in funds to the National September 11th Memorial and Memorial Plaza at the World Trade Center in New York City. That funding will provide critical support for the continued operation, maintenance, and security of the site. In all, nearly 3,000 people were killed in the terror attacks in New York, at the Pentagon, and aboard United Flight 93 in Pennsylvania. Secretary Haaland visited Ottawa, Canada, to highlight the United States' ongoing work with Canadian leadership, ensuring that Indigenous communities have the support and resources they need to prosper. Joined by Assistant Secretary for Insular and International Affairs Carmen Cantor and Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs Brian Newland, the Secretary represented the United States at the 5th meeting of the Trilateral Working Group on Violence Against Indigenous Women and Girls. That group was established by American, Canadian, and Mexican leaders to address the high rates of violence against Indigenous women and girls as a regional concern. Interior announced significant steps to protect the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge and more than 13 million acres in the National Petroleum Reserve in Alaska. That includes Interior's cancellation of the remaining oil and gas leases issued by the previous administration in the Arctic Refuge. The Bureau of Land Management is also proposing new regulations for the Petroleum Reserve that would ensure maximum protection for its more than 13 million acres of special areas, while supporting subsistence activities for Alaska Native communities. Deputy Secretary Tommy Beaudreau this week announced the final report from the Interagency Working Group on mining laws, regulations, and permitting to reform and improve the way mining is performed on U.S. public lands. There are more than 60 recommendations to Congress and federal agencies, including better public and tribal engagement, permitting processes that are more consistent and predictable, and protecting impacted communities and workers, as well as the environmental and culturally sensitive lands they cherish. Interior this week announced $180 million in initial funding from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law for a new large-scale water recycling program through the Bureau of Reclamation, aimed at creating new water supplies that are less vulnerable to drought and climate change. The program will play an important role in helping communities develop local, drought-resistant water supplies by turning unusable water sources into clean, reliable ones. Interior this week announced $5 million from President Biden's Investing in America agenda to support the restoration of bison populations and grassland ecosystems in tribal communities. The funding will support tribally led initiatives to strengthen bison conservation and expansion, improve management of existing herds, and ecosystem restoration efforts in native grassland habitats. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Director Martha Williams visited Sachuest Point National Wildlife Refuge, part of the Rhode Island National Wildlife Refuge Complex, to get a first-hand look at work funded by the Great American Outdoors Act, or GOA. Interior leaders have been on the road throughout the summer months to highlight the success and importance of GOA funding on public lands. The Fish and Wildlife Service this week announced more than $10.5 million from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law to support 59 strategic projects in western states focused on habitat restoration in sagebrush country. Deputy Director Shiva Sundrasan made that announcement at the Wind River Indian Reservation in Wyoming. America's sagebrush ecosystem is the largest contiguous ecotype in the United States. It's home to more than 350 species across the West, including pronghorn, elk, mule deer, and greater sage grouse. The National Park Service and partners this week announced $25.7 million in Save America's Treasures grants. The funding will support 58 projects in 26 states, the Virgin Islands, and the District of Columbia that will preserve nationally significant sites and collections. Interior this week joins the national celebration of Hispanic Heritage Month, which runs from September 15th to October 15th. It honors the history and culture of both Hispanic and Latino Americans, their achievements, and their contributions to American life. And our social media picture of the week, the surreal and delicate rock formations of Fantasy Canyon. Located in northeast Utah, the naturally weathered sandstone rises dramatically from clay beds, exposing fantastically colored and shaped configurations. Make sure you follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. That's This Week at Interior.
Last month at Interior.
This week at Interior. Secretary Haaland and Deputy Secretary Tommy Beaudreau joined administration leaders in New York City to commemorate Climate Week 2023, an annual event that focuses on the challenges presented by a warming planet. In remarks at the Clinton Global Initiative, Secretary Haaland announced a $15 million commitment to the Indian Youth Service Corps and other programs supporting the next generation of conservation and climate stewards. Across town, Deputy Secretary Tommy Beaudreau joined state and federal leaders on a panel to discuss the Biden-Harris administration's all-of-government approach to building a clean energy future that will create jobs, boost local economies, and help address environmental injustice. The Biden-Harris administration this week announced an historic agreement to support tribally led efforts to restore healthy and abundant salmon populations in the upper Columbia River Basin. The agreement between the United States, the Confederated Tribes of the Colville Reservation, the Coeur d'Alene Tribe, and the Spokane Tribe of Indians will help fund ongoing efforts to test the feasibility of reintroducing anadromous salmonids in blocked area habitats in the basin. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and Pyramid Lake Paiute Tribe broke ground on a fish passage project at Numana Dam with funding from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. Deputy Director Shiva Sunderson joined representatives from the Bureau of Indian Affairs, Bureau of Reclamation, and partners to celebrate the project, which will benefit the recovery of two federally listed species, the Lahontan cutthroat trout and Kiwi sucker in northern Nevada. Interior this week announced nearly $40 million through the president's Investing in America agenda to help tribal communities plug and remediate orphaned oil and gas wells across Indian country. This investment is a critical step in supporting tribal land rights and economic opportunities to address legacy pollution, reduce harmful methane leaks, and tackle environmental hazards that threaten tribal communities. Interior's Bureau of Ocean Energy Management and the Energy Department's Grid Deployment Office this week released an action plan for offshore wind transmission development in the U.S. Atlantic region. It's a set of bold actions that will catalyze offshore wind energy, strengthen the domestic supply chain, and create good-paying union jobs. The plan outlines immediate actions needed to connect the first generation of Atlantic offshore wind projects onto the electric grid and longer-term efforts to support needed transmission over the next several decades. The Bureau of Land Management this week issued 2 new leases in the Amargosa Solar Energy Zone in Nevada. That means the leaseholder can proceed with next steps in the development of utility-scale solar energy. In June, the BLM auctioned 4 parcels across nearly 24,000 acres in the Amargosa Desert in the highest-yielding onshore renewable energy auction in agency history. Secretary Haaland this week applauded the designation of Ohio's Hopewell Ceremonial Earthworks as a World Heritage Site. Hopewell is a group of 8 ancient earthwork sites built between 1500 and 2200 years ago by indigenous peoples now referred to as the Hopewell culture. The vast network of precise geometrical shapes aligns with both solar and lunar cycles. And our social media picture of the week, meet this hoary marmot at Rocky Mountain National Park. Turns out bears aren't the only mammals fattening up in preparation for the long winter. Hoary marmots also build up large fat stores in the summer and early fall to get them through up to 8 months of hibernation. Make sure you follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. That's This Week at Interior.
Last month at Interior.
This week at Interior. Secretary Haaland and Bureau of Land Management Director Tracy Stone Manning visited Berryessa Snow Mountain National Monument this week to meet with federal, tribal, state, and local officials and community members to learn about their vision for conserving the natural and cultural resources in the region. The Secretary heard about proposals to expand the existing national monument to protect culturally important sites on adjacent BLM-managed public land. The Secretary then traveled to Colorado, where she highlighted how investments being made through President Biden's Investing in America agenda are putting people to work to plug and remediate orphaned oil and gas wells and reduce the risk of wildland fire. She also visited Rocky Mountain National Park, where she toured several projects funded by the Great American Outdoors Act to improve recreational access for park visitors. At the White House Summit on Building Climate Resilient Communities this week, Secretary Haaland announced new policies to strengthen Interior's ability to meet its mission in the face of a changing climate. For the first time, the department will factor the climate crisis into every facet of its operations. The new policies will make for clearer and more consistent climate information to be used across the department. Interior also announced that all of its bureaus and offices have moved forward in the effort to implement Secretary Haaland's directive to phase out single-use plastics on public lands over the next decade. Plastics are devastating fish and wildlife around the world. Less than 10% of the plastic ever produced has been recycled. Interior this week announced the launch of an oral history project that will document and make accessible the experiences of the generations of indigenous children who attended the federal Indian boarding school system. This effort, the first of its kind to be undertaken by the federal government, is part of the Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative launched by Secretary Haaland to ensure stories and experiences from survivors can be shared with current and future generations. The Biden-Harris administration's Wildland Fire Mitigation and Management Commission released its report this week, outlining a comprehensive, consensus-based set of recommendations to address the nation's wildfire crisis. The recommendations provide strategies for transforming our wildland fire response approach from reactive to proactive, building sustainable and long-term solutions, and creating communities and landscapes that are more resilient and adaptable to wildfire as a fundamental part of our world. Interior this week renewed its commitment to support civil rights protections for all Americans, as the Biden-Harris administration clarified its position that Title VI of the Civil Rights Act prohibits certain forms of anti-Semitic, Islamophobic, and related forms of discrimination and bias in federally funded programs and activities. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Director Martha Williams visited Lacassine National Wildlife Refuge in Louisiana this week to highlight how the bipartisan infrastructure law is helping to fund the cleanup of pollution left behind by orphan wells. Director Williams toured the refuge with Louisiana Governor John Bel Edwards, meeting with refuge staff and with contractors involved in the cleanup efforts. The National Park Service this week added 23 new listings to the National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom. The program recognizes places and programs with connection to the Underground Railroad and the resistance to enslavement through escape or flight in the years before the Civil War. A church in Canada with ties to Harriet Tubman is the first international site added to the network. BLM Director Tracy Stone Manning and BLM California State Director Karen Moritzen toured the Cosumnes River Preserve this week, part of the Cosumnes Watershed Restoration Landscape. That's where the president's Investing in America agenda is infusing $7.6 million for improvements and restoration to the wetlands, protecting native plants and conducting fuels treatments. Fat Bear Week returns to Katmai National Park and Preserve this October 4th through the 10th, and we need your help to crown the fattest bear. The brown bears of Brooks River have spent the summer fattening up to survive winter hibernation. Now they contend for the title of champion. You can check out the live cams and find out more about this year's contest at fatbearweek.org. And our social media picture of the week, we're shining a light on a park that stretches about 185 miles from Washington, D.C. to Cumberland, Maryland. The Chesapeake and Ohio Canal National Historical Park provides a place to enjoy nature and recreation while preserving America's early transportation history along the Potomac River. Make sure you follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. That's This Week at Interior.